we're about ready to get started. So welcome everyone to tonight's webinar from Sussex Ornithological Society. My name is Jack Thompson and I'm the RSPB's Conservation Officer for Sussex and other counties across the southeast of England. I'm also a member of the Sussex Ornithological Society and your host for this evening. So tonight we're welcoming Claire Smith to our virtual stage. Claire is a senior policy officer for the RSPB and is the lead for highly pathogenic avian influenza. Claire has been at the RSPB since 2006, covering a variety of different roles, working with seabirds and upland birds in Scotland, predominantly around the Perthshire area and the wider Cairngorms National Park. So from capercaillie to white-tailed seagulls, Claire's helped deliver some important species and habitat projects throughout her career at the RSPB. For the past 3 years, though, the current strain of highly pathogenic avian influenza has unfortunately been impacting bird populations in the UK and worldwide. So Claire is here today to help bring us up to speed with what is currently being implemented to mitigate the risk and the impacts this is having on local bird populations. Before we do get started, I've just got some quick housekeeping to run through. So as this is a Zoom webinar, you won't be able to turn on your video or your microphone, but you will be able to ask questions using the Q&A box, which you can find just at the bottom of your screen. We have time allocated for a Q&A at the end of the session, but please do just pop any questions into the Q&A box at any time during the presentation, and we'll be able to pick these up at the end. It's very much welcome to just send in questions as soon as you think of them, and if anyone's anything like me, they'd have forgotten the questions by the time it's moved on a couple of slides anyway. So it also allows us to jump straight into questions right from the off after the presentation. Also, just to state as well that the presentations in this session are being recorded and will be available on the Sussex Ornithological Society YouTube channel not too long after the event. So right, that's me. I've got my housekeeping spiel out the way. So let's get back to what everyone's dialed in to hear more about. So without further ado, please take it away, Claire.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, Jack. Yes, my name is Claire Smith. I'm based in our UK policy team, so I'm up in Perthshire, in Scotland, but I cover the whole of UK for bird flu policy. So I'll give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what's been happening in the UK with bird flu since 2021. A bit of a background on what bird flu is. Some of the known impacts, really zooming in on seabirds, some of the population impacts on seabirds, and also give you a bit of an overview of RSPB's policy work and other science work on bird flu as well. I should stress as well that I'm not a virologist, I am an ornithologist, so I very much come at this as from a sort of bird point of view, not a virus point of view, but I will try and explain a bit about the background of the virus as well. And do as well, if there are questions that we can't answer tonight, happy for you to email me afterwards, and I can always get back to you as well, because this is obviously quite a fast-moving situation. So first of all, I'll just give you a bit of a background on what bird flu is. So one of those annoying things where we use interchangeable terms, so bird flu, avian influenza. We are generally, with this outbreak, talking about the highly pathogenic kind, which basically means it causes a lot of deaths, has high mortality rates in a lot of species. So low pathogenic avian influenza has been around as long as birds have been around, and the proportion of birds that sort of suffer from it varies by different groups. So things like ducks are really susceptible to low pathogenic avian influenza. They can carry the virus and shed the virus for 2 or 3 weeks and make a full recovery. And other species vary quite a lot. It's not really a disease that we see in passerines and garden birds that much, but it is something that occurs naturally. And then highly pathogenic avian influenza is something that evolved in really intensive poultry farming situations. So it's been around really since the 1960s. But as the numbers of kind of poultry operations and intensive poultry operations has increased globally, these new types of highly pathogenic have kept emerging more and more and more. This current strain, the H5N1 strain, first emerged in some duck farming in China in 1996, and then passed over to wild birds. And then what happens is the viruses move backwards and forwards and continue to mutate. So they get moved with poultry operations, but then also get moved along migration routes as well. So people will probably remember we have had past bird flu outbreaks in the UK. There was one in the mid-2000s, which was considered quite a big event, but we were really talking about tens of cases. You know, we would be concerned if there were 5 or 10 dead birds across the whole of Great Britain in that situation. So this is a real order of magnitude that's different. There are lots of different strains of bird flu. So the most dominant strain in the UK at the moment is H5N1. And anyone that remembers all the COVID graphics we used to see on the news, and the H number and the N number refer to the sort of protein spikes on the outside of the virus. So you also get H5N8, you get H7N7, and there's different strains interacting at different times globally. But since 2020 across Europe, it's really been H5N1 that's been the dominant type. And of that, we've had 12 different genotypes across the UK. And some of the things that make it unprecedented are usually highly pathogenic avian influenza is a winter virus, so it likes cold and wet. But this particular strain has done better at surviving in hotter, drier conditions, and that's meant it's persisted through the spring and summer. It's had a real diversity of hosts in terms of the number of bird and mammal species it's in, really high levels of mortality, and also that we stopped seeing these seasonal patterns of infection that we used to see with other types of the virus as well. And we have started just in the last month seeing H5N5 in the UK as well, and I'll come back to that right to the end to just explain a bit about that as well. So just to illustrate how the virus is becoming more diverse and more persistent, this just really shows with the years along the bottom, and then the breadth of that really shows the genetic diversity of viruses. You can see from sort of 2020 onwards, you know, things have become far, far more diverse. And then on the right, that just shows how these different types are evolving and the different group hosts that they're in. So you can see with the, in terms of the regions, you can see how from sort of the mid-2010s onwards that things started really picking up in Europe. And also you can see how things have shifted to being those bands of wilder birds have got wider as well. So there's more cases in wild birds, whereas before we were seeing more cases in poultry as well. And again, this just shows this globally. This is always a bit out of date. So up until September, things hadn't reached some of South America, but it reached the Galapagos in September, which is obviously a concern because there's a lot of endemic seabirds there. Reached the Falklands in October 2023, and then reached Antarctica properly in the kind of last few weeks. So now the only continent globally where there isn't HPAI is sort of Oceania, so Australia and New Zealand as well, who are really kind of on high alert. And that is really based on migration routes, and it's really about kind of separation of migration routes that means that things haven't reached there yet. And the problem with this, of course, is that you then get things, birds carrying stuff from the breeding season and the wintering season, and things are kind of constantly going backwards and forwards. And again, what has been really unusual is the wide range of species impacted, sort of testing positive. So over 350 wild bird species worldwide. In the UK, we're up to about 78 wild bird species. There's always a bit of uncertainty around that number because DEFRA's reporting of species can be a little bit awry. So you do get things which are hawks or doves and things like that. And also a lot of mammals as well. So there was a recent paper showing there's been 48 species of mammal which have been infected worldwide so far. And the first ruminants have tested positive for bird flu, some goats in North America just in the last month. So prior to that, it's all been sort of predatory mammal species and things like mustelids, and also some of the sort of dog species are the things that seem to be impacted the most. There's no clear evidence yet that there's a lot of mammal to mammal transfer. They seem to be dead-end hosts, and it seems to be that they are, when you do get big infections in mammals, it's because they're coming into contact repeatedly with a lot of bird flu in wild birds as well. And you can see on the left just the diversity of different groups that are really impacted and how that's changed, how that compares to previous bird flu outbreaks as well. The other thing that's quite interesting is obviously reporting. There's a lot of global reporting systems around not just bird flu, but all sorts of infectious diseases in livestock. And all of this reporting is set up towards, you know, farmed livestock. So it's about positive cases in animals. It doesn't really give you a good picture of the mortality and population impacts, because you could get one data point whether you've had one, dead wild bird or 10,000 dead wild birds. So that's why all these things are a little bit skewed, and we're on catch up a bit with our reporting. And just a few headlines on some of these high mortality impacts. So I'll kind of circle back around and zoom in on the UK more, and what we know about our seabird populations. But there have been a few reports and studies and things you'll have probably seen in the media about really high numbers of die-offs of birds. So in the UK, the first one was the barnacle geese on the Solway. We did have great skuas dying before then, but they were kind of in tens. They weren't really sort of thousands of birds. Big die-offs of terns all across Europe, and also a lot of big impacts in South America as well. So we've had a really big outbreak in sort of pelicans, in boobies and cormorants, and then also sea lions all along Peru, which was happening several months ago last year as well, which went through really quickly. So just to zoom in on the UK a bit, this current strain of HPAI was first reported in great skuas in 2021. So it was first picked up in April 2021 around kind of the Northern Isles, so in Shetland, Orkney. There were some birds on Hander, and then around the Western Isles, and it was a real sort of curious anomaly. It was sort of tens of birds were dying at each of these colonies. They all got sent off and tested for stuff because they were exhibiting symptoms and things that people really didn't associate with great skuas. Great skuas had never had bird flu before. It wasn't reported in great skuas before. There's still a bit of a unknown about how it first got there. For some of the species that had been impacted, great skuas and tern species, you can track them back to some of the wintering grounds where they've interacted with pelicans, and there is a suggestion that they might have picked up in the wintering ground and then brought it over when they migrated. So that was really seen as some kind of anomaly that happened just for a few months in the summer. Then things were quite quiet, and then when we got into November and December, we saw these really big die-offs in barnacle geese on the Solway, so around RSPB's Mersey Head Reserve, and over 13,000 birds were recorded dead there. So a really big impact. And then as we moved into the spring and summer of 2022, we saw really big impacts on seabirds, particularly in Scotland. So HPAI is highly transmissible. So there's three main ways that the virus moves between birds. So it can be from excretions. So it can be from any sorts of excretions. It can be picked up from scavenging, and also because it does really like wet conditions. So it's really present in bathing pools, or in pools where you might have birds breeding on islands or on rafts. And it can persist for quite a long time. So one of the areas where there hasn't been a lot of good sort of in the field research is around persistence. There's a lot of information in lab conditions, so in things in test tubes and keeping things in the dark, or keeping them, they're not open to things like rain or UV. So we know that things can persist for up to a year in kind of optimum cold, wet conditions, but there's still quite a bit of work to do to see how long it persists, out in the wild and in some of these conditions. But obviously seabirds are really kind of right in amongst it. So you've either got really densely breeding birds who are, excreting all over each other and are really on top of each other and during the breeding season. And when you've got things like terns, their chicks will be wandering around and also moving the virus around. And then you've also got species that are scavenging as well, so birds that are eating other birds, and also birds that are using bathing pools like great skuas do as well. So the summer in Scotland was really sort of devastating in 2022. We saw these really big impacts in great skuas, and that was the second year then, the second summer that great skuas have been impacted in gannets and on tern species. And everyone was really scrambling to try and get a handle on things, in terms of trying to record the impact and in terms of people trying to pivot their operations to understand what we could and couldn't do, from keeping sort of staff and visitors safe, and also what we should do in terms of sort of research and monitoring. So all of the sort of the government bodies like Nature's Scot and Natural England all kind of came together to set up a way to record mortality, because we didn't really have a good system in this country of recording dead birds. And BTO made quite a few. If anyone uses BirdTrack regularly, you realise that they've made quite a few changes over the last couple of years to BirdTrack to make it easier to record dead birds as well. There had to be a real sort of gear shift in terms of the testing as well. So the testing. So testing wild birds was always really seen as a warning system for poultry. So it was always about, you know, how near are these wild birds that are infected to poultry, and what sort of things do we need to put in place. So even for getting birds for remote places for testing, none of that was set up. RSPB and lots of other organisations really had to pivot in terms of making sure our staff had good information, making sure they had appropriate PPE. And there were a lot of things that happened in 2022 that luckily won't happen now. So there was quite an all stop on ringing. So anyone who's a bird ringer will probably remember it was quite difficult then to do things, to know what you could and couldn't do, and you're probably getting different information from different places. In Scotland, Nature's Scot shut a lot of its bird reserves to visitors because there was concern about people spreading the virus between colonies. And it was really difficult. There were a lot of meetings and people kind of scrambling to try and do the right thing. The other thing which really didn't make the headlines as much, because the numbers are not as big, is we've had quite a lot of birds of prey that test positive as well. So we've had buzzards and peregrines probably nearly every week since the outbreak began. And peregrines are a species that in previous outbreaks across Europe and other places have really struggled to recover and bounce back from the virus. And some unusual species as well. So things like hen harriers have tested positive, which when you've got some small populations in areas of Wales and in parts of England could have quite a devastating effect. And then probably less surprising, things like white-tailed eagles and golden eagles as well. And then as we moved into the winter of 22-23, the virus sort of really shifted again and became much more widespread. So this is where we were starting to see it really evident in parks. So anyone who would be going to a local park where there'd be gulls and ducks and geese and swans, they were seeing large numbers of dead birds everywhere. So it became much more kind of in the public's consciousness, I think, in that winter, because people were just seeing it all over their local areas. Mute-sons especially got particularly badly hit in winter 22-23, and obviously were so visible when you were seeing dead birds around the countryside as well. And then up in Scotland, Greenland barnacle geese on Islay were really badly hit, and those numbers have not yet bounced back. And just to dig in a little bit more about some of the mechanisms of how seabirds in particular might be moving the virus between different colonies. So of course you've got all of the breeders who are packed in tightly, but you've got non-breeders and prospecting birds. And not a lot is necessarily known about the movements of some of those birds between colonies, but there's quite a lot of evidence, especially when we look at what happened with black-headed gulls in 2023, about how birds might be moving things in between colonies, and also at stopover points as well. So you can start to see how a virus could move quite quickly to a lot of different places as well. And then just on top of that, the virus itself can also impact birds' movement. So one of my colleagues, Jude Lane at RSPB, well, we had a lot of birds that were satellite tagged anyway, and we can quite neatly compare how some of these birds were behaving in their foraging in years before the outbreak and then after the outbreak as well. And you can see at the bottom, they were doing some really wide-ranging trips. And it's really unknown why that was. Was it because the virus was affecting their behavior? Was it because they were trying to get away from an infected colony? But you can see how that would have just spread the virus further, because they were going and checking out completely different colonies as well, and probably interacts with the fact that the breeding attempts were failing as well. So as we were going through 2022 and we had all this information on, you probably would have seen lots of headlines about various numbers of dead birds. So we knew we'd counted sort of 5,000 dead gannets on Grassholm. There were various estimates for dead gannets on the Bass Rock, but we knew that these were vast underestimates. Lots of the sites weren't visited because of bird flu. Lots of them obviously not counted annually anyway. And a lot of birds will be falling off into the sea. So it'd be really difficult to to count some of these birds. And then some birds would probably be dying, you know, at the end of the season or after the season as well. So we really need to work out what the population impact was on our seabirds. And the timing of this was also really difficult because we had just, you know, RSPB with a huge number of partners had just completed the latest seabirds count census, which I'm sure some people here might have helped out with. So the last counts for that were undertaken in 2021, and then the virus really hit seabirds in 2022. So we knew that some of our population, our most up-to-date population estimates were really already out of date. And that's really important for things like offshore wind and developments, making sure people are using the right populations when they're working out their impacts. It's really important for trying to put pressure on government to really speed up actions on things, because we knew that we were when using figures that were out of date, especially for some species where their populations might have stabilised or been slightly increasing. And this just shows some of the trends. So we had some species when we got to the end of 2021 where the trends were showing that they were increasing. Some were stable. So some of the key ones were, you know, things like northern gannet and roseate tern that have been increasing, and then some other species decreasing as well. And of course, the important thing to remember about bird flu is it's an additional threat. You know, none of the other threats that sadly affect seabirds have gone away. This is an additional threat on top of these other things, which is exacerbating them as well. So RSPB, working with a range of partners, pulled together doing some updated colony counts. So what we did is we really focused on we tried to focus on species that had been definitely impacted by bird flu, or ones where we absolutely didn't know. So we pulled together this list of species, and then we couldn't repeat the whole seabirds count again, because that's a huge effort to do in 1 year. But we tried to cover a really large proportion of these species and trying to get a handle on what the impacts of bird flu had been. And we used all the sort of standard methods that we would use in seabirds count, so that things were comparable. So for gannet, you're using breeding sites or nests. And of course, for gannets, we do use a lot of drone surveys as well on gannet. So that means, yeah, that's really nice and easy to compare between years as well, because you can use the same drone operators, carry it out at the same time in the same conditions, and make sure you're comparing between years. So you're looking at you know, apparently occupied sites or nests. And then for kittiwakes, we were using counting nest sites. For guillemots, counting individuals, which is, having done this myself, is one of the really really tricky ones to do, especially if you're on a boat. There's a really nice comparison here of the kind of the boat view compared to the drone view, and how many birds, you know, you could be missing in those different methods, and why it's really important to try and you know, calibrate those. And then for great skewers, where we covered, I think, 80% of the population across Scotland, it was walking lots and lots and lots of transects. And it was really interesting what a different experience that was for the surveyors. So anyone who knows great skewers, you know, they're birds who normally, you know, will dive bomb, will really show you that they're there and breeding, because by the time they got to carry out these surveys in 2023 and the species had been hit by bird flu twice, you were walking really long distances in some of these big dense areas and not seeing birds. So it was a really kind of sobering experience, I think, particularly to do the great skewer surveys. And there are some videos on the RSPB YouTube channel of some of the surveyors carrying out some of these different surveys as well. And the other thing with these surveys was the rush was to try and get them done before bird flu impacted again in 2023 for some sites. So there was a real rush to get them done in the correct windows, but also being really worried that, you know, you wanted to get that snapshot before flu hit again. And then for lots of the large gulls, it was counting nests, so that was using a lot of drones as well. And then with terns, counting nest sites as well. So that could be transects or vantage points, depending on you know, where the birds were breeding and the terrain. And then this shows you some of the results and the percentage changes after HPAI. So the really big impacts were on things like roseate tern, northern gannet, and great skewer, particularly on great skewer. So there's been over 75% decline in great skewer across Scotland, which is really key because we do have 60% of the global population. So that is thousands of birds. You know, we are thousands of birds down. And compared to the numbers of dead birds we were recording, we only recorded something like just over 2,000 dead great skewers, whereas the impact is we've probably lost about 10,000 birds. That really shows you the importance of doing, you know, updated population counts and not just relying on mortality impacts as well. The other reason it's really important to these updated population counts is in terms of when you're talking to decision makers and politicians, there was often a narrative that, you know, it was chicks that were dying, that they'd all bounce back and it would all be fine, which is obviously not how seabird ecology works. And so being able to understand the impact on the breeding adult population is really important, and to get that follow through into government documents, and those being the populations that you're using. Also some big reductions in tern species as well, and then some quite mixed results. So kittiwake were quite an interesting one because they declined in some of the countries, but actually had since their count was carried out in seabirds count, they had increased slightly in Northern Ireland. So that kind of changed the percentage change after bird flu as well. But 9 out of the 13 species that we'd surveyed had declined by over 10%. So I'll just zoom in on some of these impacts now, and you can see where some of the counts were carried out. So gannets, we lost 25% across the sites surveyed, and there you can see the major sites that were covered. And these were some of the shots that we were seeing from the Bass Rock. I mean, it's really, really stark, you know, the gaps that are in the populations, and that massive change in density from what you normally have on the sites as well. And great skewer, as I said, so we covered over 81% of the Scottish population. So we did have good data from some colonies on dead great skewers. So on Fula, 1,400 dead birds were counted in 2022, and that was real meticulous counting of going and then, you know, spray painting every bird, so you didn't, you know, double count it and things like that. But it still didn't capture the true impact across the whole of the species range as well. And that was a species that previously had been increasing. So it had increased by 14% between the last seabird census and this one, but now all of that is wiped out with such a massive decline. And then for some of the tern species, so common terns had a decline of 42%. And it's just to remind you, these counts were carried out in 2023. So this doesn't take into account further impacts in 2023. This is just really accounting for the 2022 impacts. And you can see lots of the sites there, some of which will be really familiar to you where counts were carried out. And then sandwich tern as well. So there's lots been written and published about impacts on sandwich tern across Europe as well. So unsurprising to see that big decline of 35% across sites. And their numbers were previously stable. And then roseate tern was one that was in the news a lot. So Coquette was a site that was really badly impacted in 2022. And again, you know, seeing years and years of kind of positive conservation work, you know, wiped out by bird flu is obviously really distressing for everybody who's working there. So what's really important to emphasize is the impact this had on some species that had either been increasing or were stable. Then even more devastating is the species that, you know, in the last seabird census had already been declining, and then this is a real additional pressure on these as well. So kittiwake, as I was saying, is quite an interesting one. So we recounted 36% of the kittiwake population. So there had been a really big decrease between the last seabird census and the most recent one of 43%. And then there was a slight increase in the 2023 count of overall change of 8%. And it's quite unclear if that's due to what that's down to. So kittiwakes were impacted again in 2023 at the end of the season. And also for this species, we did cover a smaller proportion than some of the others. Guillemots had quite a small impact of bird flu. They were again quite an interesting species where some colonies were quite badly impacted by bird flu and others weren't. I should have said at the beginning, there's a lot of nuance between how different species are impacted, even quite closely related species as well. And there's just not enough that we know about levels of immunity or how the virus operates in quite similar species. And then moving on to 2023, so we had this winter where we had a really sort of widespread level of the virus, and people were seeing it all through their wintering birds. And then we got into the 3rd or 4th week of March. So we knew from speaking to BirdLife partners in Europe that black-headed gulls in their wintering grounds had been quite badly impacted. And some of those birds come over and back and breed here. And we first started seeing impacts, big die-offs of hundreds of black-headed gulls in the Midlands right at the end of March. And then that gradually kind of spread out between all those colonies, first in England, then in Wales, and then across to Northern Ireland. And we don't have that many big black-headed gull colonies in Scotland, so it didn't really reach here in the same kind of impacts. But you can see from the graph how the number of mortalities really increased and took off quite quickly. And that was because we had a slightly different dominant genotype. So there was the high pathogenic avian influenza had recombined with the low pathogenic avian influenza that occurs in gulls naturally, and that had formed a high pathogenic version that meant it just went through gulls really quickly. So the big impacts were on black-headed gulls, but we also had die-offs and things like herring gulls. And then it meant it was well suited to kittiwakes, and it also meant that the virus levels were so high, and because a lot of these birds are breeding in mixed colonies, that it got back into the terns again as well. So in 2023, the pattern was really inverted across the UK. So we didn't have bird flu reaching Scotland until right at the end of June and into July, and we didn't really have big impacts in seabirds in Scotland, but it was really widespread through seabird colonies in England. And probably a lot of these colonies hadn't had it because when the virus went through England in 2022, it really only got into the kind of northeast, and by the time it got down south, a lot of the seabirds are gone. By the time it got there, it was about September time. So in 2023, a lot of these colonies probably hadn't encountered bird flu yet, so it really went through a lot of these species. And this just shows some of the the most affected species and the numbers of dead birds that we were recording as well. So just coming on to where we are now in 2024. So this autumn and winter has been the quietest since this outbreak started in 2021. So from the DEFRA kind of positive test figures, so they do their seasons run from the 1st of October. We've had 28 wild bird positive tests since October the 1st in 14 species. And compared to the year before, we would have had, well over 200 positive tests in the same time period. So it's a lot less. And so far in this calendar year, we've had 11 birds test positive across the whole of Great Britain. Northern Ireland hasn't had a positive test for quite some time. But the interesting thing is we've had no new H5N1 detections for a couple of months, but we are now starting to see H5N5, and it's been testing in raptors, which are spread over quite a large geographical area. So there's something it obviously must be in prey populations, but we don't know much about, it's obviously not testing positive in a lot of prey populations. So again, this is a slightly different strain that first emerged in Russia in 2020. It's been persistently detected in Norway since 2021, and it's also in some other countries as well. So the fact we're finding it in these predatory species means it probably is circulating widely at low levels. It has been detected in mammals. The current understanding, although we don't know until it's in other birds, is that it's probably not more pathogenic or transmissible, because none of these other countries have been seeing really big die-offs caused by this strain. So that is quite positive, and we'll just have to, but there are obviously a lot of unknowns, and we don't know how some species will respond to it until they encounter it. So it's just, again, something to keep an eye on. I should say with the testing, every time the Animal Plant and Health Agency, APHA, which are a long arm body of DEFRA, every time they test a bird, they fully sequence the what they get in the materials. So that means that they do detect how the virus is changing, if they pick up different strains. So it's not that the test is just for one type, it's fully sequenced. So really similar again to kind of to the sort of COVID testing that was going on, where they're trying to detect, you know, new things that are coming in. So of course, what we are concerned about is long-term impacts. So particularly for seabirds and for raptor species, they are, you know, they're long-lived. They take a long time. So a lot of these species, you know, gannets and great skiers won't be breeding until they're 4 or 5 years old. They'll only be raising 1 or 2 chicks per year, and they would usually have very high survival of chicks and adults. So we are really concerned that this is going to be quite a long-term additional impact on these species as well. The other thing is that there are possibly sublethal effects that we don't know about, and we know from some studies that there are some comorbidities as well. So for example, the amount of lead in some gull species has been shown to lower their immunity and mean that they're more susceptible to dying from HPAI as well. So there are a lot of interactions that means this is something that's going to have a long-term impact. There are some hopes for immunity. So Jude Lane did a really good study with gannets, a really small number of gannets. I think it was about 16 birds. So that had blood samples taken on the bass rocks. They were apparently healthy adult birds. So we had some where blood was taken from the birds with the normal blue iris, and then some with these black eyes as well. So we don't know the exact mechanics of what causes the black eye. It's assumed it's some kind of neurological damage caused by the virus, but we found that most of the birds with the black eye did have levels of immunity, where they basically had antibodies to HPAI. What we don't know is how long that will last. We don't know if it's just for, you know, how specific that immunity is, and we don't know what impacts it would have on their, you know, their future outlook in terms of how long they live and their breeding success. So that's something that we'll keep monitoring, and it's so important to have these, you know, long-term study populations where you've got birds individually marked and you've also got satellite tagged birds, so you can try and sort of fill in all the gaps on these as well. And then for the barnacle geese on the Solway, so there was a study done last winter which showed that 75% of birds there now have got immunity, and their numbers have really bounced back. But given the way that geese can breed, then that's, you know, that's unsurprising that you've got a population there where it's easier for them to bounce back. And also there's probably some density dependent effects on the breeding ground, so that's meant that, you know, they're able to recover. We've also seen signs of immunity in shags, and there's also some indication that some gull species you know, will have dark eyes as well. But though birds did have that before avian flu as well, there is quite a variation in the colorization of the eyes of large gulls. So it's something where we need a lot more work to be done. And the important thing is about, you know, then using this information for good and using it to mean that we can put measures in to kind of to bolster survival and you know, reproductive rates, and do everything we can to kind of buy these species these times so they can pass on their immunity as well. So in terms of who we've got working on bird flu at RSPB, so there's me on the policy side, and then we also have somebody, Susie Gold, who's a virologist who we employed about a year ago to help us with some of that. And she's able to spend time on a lot of these kind of virological questions and to really try and get governments to focus on wild bird research and not just on poultry research. So we've got quite a few strands of work going on. There's some work looking at the kind of population impacts of what happened on the Solway and how what that's done to the population. We're trying to do more work on understanding immunity in seabirds in terms of how long that lasts. Susie's doing a global review of previous bird flu outbreaks. So there's a lot of information, there's a lot of things that aren't published, a lot of stuff in kind of ringing data and local reports where previous outbreaks have gone through populations and then what's happened to that population afterwards. And that's where we're getting some interesting information on, you know, particularly what happens with raptors and the long-term impacts there. We're looking at the efficacy of carcass removal. So carcass removal was carried out at some sites for sandwich terns across Europe. It's a really difficult thing. The evidence for its positive impacts is quite weak, and for it to be effective, you really have to carry it out in the first few days. So it's not something you can do at a remote site or where you might be causing disturbance to lots of other species. It's really something you need to go in quickly and do then. So we're trying to do some modelling work to work out which species it would work best for and what the best strategy would be to do. It's really hard to do in the field tests for this now, because populations of species have probably had varying levels of exposure and immunity. So it's really hard now to kind of pick apart what the impact might be as well. We're working with DEFRA to try and increase the amount of swabbing and monitoring we can do on birds. So, getting our staff trained up to swab wild birds so that we can get more tests into the labs. If they're not always able to come out and collect wild birds, that means we get more information about the impacts on them. We're also, because we have a network of predator control going on across our reserves, whether that's things like mink or whether that's some of the biosecurity work on islands. So we are providing those mammals to DEFRA as well, so that they can use that as a way to monitor how bird flu is spreading to mammals. And then environmental persistence, as I mentioned earlier, is also a really key one for us, because lots of our sites will have, especially if you have a site which is a wintering bird site and a breeding bird site, we want to know if there is anything we should be doing either with substrates or with islands or turn RAS or equipment or habitat management, so that any sort of tweaks we can make so that we make sure that the virus is not persisting and then bridging those populations between the wintering and breeding. So any sort of small things we can do there. The other thing is, the main bit of work I spend my time on is our policy work. So that's working with the UK government and the 4 devolved governments as well. So there's a lot of work linking to the sort of international work on this, making sure that there's national response plans, improving that monitoring to assess impacts on wild birds, shifting what the surveillance focus is. A precautionary approach to wildlife management one is quite an interesting one. So when the impacts were first on geese, we were making a lot of calls for there to be pauses on wildfowling, both from a population impact point of view and also disturbance point of view. And that's something that some wildfowling clubs did have voluntary bans. And in Scotland, there are a couple of times where Nature Scot did ask for bans in areas, but it's not something that we've managed to get sort of legislated for. And then also for gull licenses as well. So looking at the gull license numbers that were released by Natural England a few weeks ago, you can see that they were still granting large numbers of licenses while we were in the middle of this outbreak that was impacting gulls. And we really want there to be this feedback loop of looking at, what the population impacts have been, and then whether it is still appropriate to be issuing these licenses, which are additional pressure on top. In 2022 and 2023, we asked for a moratorium on game bird releases. So red-leg partridges aren't really affected by bird flu that much, but pheasants are, and they can shed the virus for several days. Obviously, if they're in large pens that don't have roofs, they're open to lots of wild birds, and after they're released and they're being fed in really close proximity to each other, they'll see attracting wild birds. So there is a concern that they can be a reservoir and a bridging species and can carry the virus over and maintain the virus in areas as well. And the other thing that we spend a lot of time on, we're really struggling to get addressed, is around mallard releases and mallard shoots as well. We know that there's loads of work from previous outbreaks and from lab research as well, that we know that mallards can carry the virus, shed it for 2 or 3 weeks and recover. So we do have concerns about mallard releases that are going on, without any licensing. They're not a licensable activity on some of our, most precious sites on our SPAs and SSIs as well. One of the unexpected consequences of bird flu has been its impact on the investigation of wildlife crime. So because bird flu is a notifiable disease, that means only certain labs are able to handle birds or mammals that are suspected of having bird flu. So where people would have sometimes used local vets or other labs to help deal with, to maybe have an initial look at things that might be part of a suspected wildlife crime, to carry out an X-ray or to take, look for signs of injury or to take toxicology, None of that is really able to happen now because everything has to go through the bird flu labs. And then if a bird tests positive, then there's no other investigation that's able to happen. If it tests negative, then the bird and samples can't be moved from the lab because it's contaminated because of the other stuff that it's been. So there are, we know for some of the bigger raptors as well, so for white-tailed eagles and golden eagles, there's evidence that some of them are probably dying with bird flu, not from bird flu. So there's a lot of data points that have been lost and a lot of kind of no further action taken. Also, the predatory bird monitoring scheme, which monitors, level of rodenticide and other pollutants in owls and raptors, closed in March 2023. So again, that's a lot of information lost on the impacts and the compliance levels of rodenticide. So they're things that we're constantly trying to work with people to find ways where further investigation can happen. And it is really difficult because the numbers of birds that the Animal Plant and Health Agency labs are dealing with, it's just impossible for them to do full postmortems on raptors because they're dealing with such large numbers of birds. And also they're set up to deal with disease. They're not necessarily set up to deal with investigating wildlife crime. And we also want some consideration of the possibility of vaccination for species of conservation concern. So the UK government has got a vaccination task force, but its remit, its terms of reference, it only covers poultry, captive birds, which would be kind of zoo collections or private collections, and then game birds. And wild birds have not been included in its remit. There are a lot of issues around vaccination. There is not a vaccine which is specific enough to this strain of bird flu, and there are always also concerns that you would have to repeatedly vaccinate. But we do think for some species, so for things like raptors, where you might be doing translocation projects and handling birds in quite an intensive way anyway, or for things like possibly like great skewer or roseate tern, where you've had some really severe impacts, we think that including wild birds in the vaccination task force, at least as consideration, should be something that government is spending time on. And America's doing, in California, there's some quite interesting work going on with Californian condors, with some tests with vaccination there, because they've unfortunately been really badly hit by bird flu as well. We also want governments to take a One Health approach, which means really recognising the health of humans, domestic wild animals and plants, and the wider environment all interconnected, and act with a coordinated and unified approach. So this is all the kind of thing that was, bubbled up in the public consciousness a little bit around COVID, and it also has around things like Ebola previously as well. And it's something that we, there's a lot written by the UN about this, and it's something that the government really needs to kind of bear in mind in terms of investing in research and monitoring as well. And we really need this to be a wake-up call for governments to just really speed up some of the other conservation actions that help build resilience. So things like the sand eel fishery closure, was something that government said that they'd been considering for a long time, for 20 years. But it was hoped that, the awful impacts of bird flu were a bit of a tipping point that really helped them kind of step up on that. We really need them to do that on some of these other impacts as well. So some of the ways that you can help, please do keep reporting dead birds. So if you just search for RSPB, avian flu, we've got some specific web pages, and we've got all the details of how you can report dead birds for testing. If you're a bird track user, please do report stuff on bird track, but do also report it to DEFRA so that it can get tested as well. Please keep monitoring your birds, because obviously all of this, really widespread annual monitoring is what helps us pick up what's going on as well. Do get involved in things, like Green Bird Survey, the Winter Goal Survey, which has been carried out for the first time in 20 years this winter, and it will be going again next winter. So, do try and help with things like that. RSPB and also BTO have both got sort of wildlife disease funds, and we are, RSPB is doing work on other diseases as well, because there are obviously impacts on other birds as well. And there's just a specific sort of thank you for all of the funders and all of the staff and volunteers who helped out with all the 2023 seabird surveys. That's it.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Claire, for a really informative talk. And there are some sobering figures, images, and reporting over the past 3 years, but it's it's just really important that we're looking at this, we're understanding the data, and like you said in your presentation, we're using it for advocacy work with decision makers and politicians, and just getting the right messages out. So it's just so important we have that up-to-date science and data to inform organizations involved in conservation work to make the best possible decisions for all of us, for these populations, in when it comes down to things like reserve management, but also how we influence policy and help prevent further losses as much as possible. I'll let any additional questions to slowly filter through, so please do pop questions into the Q&A section. But we do already have quite a few to cover, so the number of questions. So we'll jump straight right into that. So first up, we've got a question for Claire from Claire. Another Claire, which is, I've heard that avian flu has spread to the elephant seal populations in South Georgia and Argentina. Do you have any insights on this?
Not probably no more than is in the media. So we do work. RSPB works really closely with bird flu partners, particularly in Europe. But for those areas where we're not directly, and we do some direct work in Falklands, but areas where we're not directly working, only probably the same as you've heard. So yeah, there have been big die-offs so all of that group, all of the kind of seal group, seem to be pretty susceptible to bird flu. There was a concern, I think, particularly in Argentina, that it was maybe moving from mammal to mammal, but we think that from the studies people have done, we think that they were just surrounded by dead birds, and because they were in the water, they were kind of in a big soup of it. So yeah, there was a really big die-off. I think it's probably too soon to know what the long-term population impacts are for there. And then for Antarctica, we're really just at the kind of the start of understanding where positive tests are. So it's really too early to know what population impacts are. And again, it's really tricky because some of the same decisions we were making 2 years ago are being made there, where some people are deciding not to go into areas because of concern of spreading, especially where people are monitoring moving between different islands with boats and equipment. So it might be some time before we understand the impacts. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There have been impacts on elephant seals.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Claire. So a question from Roger. So there seems to have been numerous new diseases arising in humans, plants, amphibians, fish, and other species in recent years. Is it thought that there is any commonality in the etiological processes involved?
I think it's a real mixture. So some diseases, there is a climate element. So either because conditions are changing or where things are changing, so they're being brought into contact with different. So that's particularly for things like some of the fungus impacts in amphibians, also for trike in some of our finches, also Yuzutu, which we're starting to see in blackbirds and things. That's to do with things like mosquitoes spreading their range, and because mosquitoes are spreading their range, then the diseases coming with them. So there's that. And then for the things where they're linked to people impact, so whether that's things like bushmeat or intensive farming, they are, things have definitely changed, and people and livestock and wildlife are brought in increasingly closer and closer and closer. And for bird flu specifically, the numbers of poultry farmed worldwide has just increased, and you have a lot of really intensive practices in Asia, and then you also have the sort of geographical layout of things. So in the Netherlands, which has huge amounts of poultry farming, the whole country is a wetland and has loads of fantastic habitat and wild birds, but it means that those poultry farms are all in amongst it. It's very different to how poultry is spread across the UK, where we have kind of pockets of it. So there's different things going on depending on the disease, I think. But I think that's where we do need this One Health approach, because there needs to be more investment into understanding how these things are connected, and then how we could address them or lessen the impacts, I think.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Claire. Okay, we're gonna have to just go straight through loads of these questions. They're coming in thick and fast. So Ayana asks, can you please explain how population viability is impacted by the disease? Can the birds breed, but then their chicks may not survive, or do their clutches fail altogether?
Well, it's the adults that were dying. So all those numbers I was quoting of thousands of birds, that was adults dying. And then I was in Shetland in June 2022, and there was, you'd have great skewers where one bird was dead, the other bird was sitting on an egg or trying to feed a chick, but that's not going to last long. So yeah, adults dying. We did have, depending on when the virus reached places, so when it reached Scotland last summer, we did have kittiwake chicks, that were dying late on in season, but some of it's because the adults died and then they died because they weren't being fed. So yeah, the population is really about the adult impact. So seabirds can survive if you have a few years of bad productivity, because the birds are so long lived, because they're living 30 to 60 years, the population would be unaffected. But once you lose those adults, that has a big impact on the populations.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, the next question is from Beverly. What is the RSPB lobbying for the government to do? And I believe this question came through perhaps during one of the slides where you were covering this. So I know you covered on the moratorium on game bird releases and other advocacy work, like One Health approach you mentioned, and also progressing other conservation actions for resilience. But were there any other pieces of lobbying work that you're doing on top of already the large amount that's being delivered?
I think on a very broad brush and thinking about new governments, it's also about increasing that investment in wildlife disease, because you need physical labs and people and expertise. And yeah, and if you go on the RSPB avian flu webpage, there's a good bullet point about things we've been asking government to do, and we did do a blog about it recently as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Claire. And then another question from Ayana, which is, are there any ways of protecting, believe it's native bird populations? This may be far-fetched as a lot of them are migratory or dispersed over large areas, but is it even a possibility? And likewise, I think this question came through around one of the slides where you were covering this. So I know you covered the assessment of the possibility of vaccination for species of conservation concern. And are there any other protective measures that we're currently looking at?
There are things possibly around UV and even things like chlorine, if you were really trying to really intensively manage something, about how you might treat. So things like for the roseate terns, because they use nest boxes, when birds have been infected, that you can remove that nest box, completely bleach it, put it back out, and that's really, kind of one on run, really intensive stuff. I think the reality with bird flu is we probably are not going to be able to do much to stop the virus. So it's about all the things we can do to stop all those comorbidities, bolster survival, bolster productivity, I think is going to be the key thing. Because as you say, it's a really complicated picture in terms of how birds move.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, another question from Beverly, which is specifically referring poultry farming as the source of the virus. What practices should change?
So yeah, I should stress, because I probably didn't make it clear enough. It is in terms of bird flu arriving in the UK, there hasn't ever been proof that it's come from poultry in the UK to UK wild birds, but we do know generally, and from other countries, it does move backwards and forwards. It's probably its intensity. It's the large numbers of intensely farmed birds are a breeding ground for these viruses to breed and mutate very, very quickly, and especially have a quick turnaround of birds, not living long and then more being bred. So it probably just needs to be less intense. Probably also things around outflows, around things. So rodents aren't impacted by bird flu, but they can carry it on their fur as well. So there can be spreads like that. So biosecurity around it as well.
Okay, thank you. So we've got an anonymous question, which is actually similar to a question I was gonna raise, which was the media coverage for the situation good? Obviously, it's really difficult to find that very fine balance of getting the importance of this work across, but then not allowing for a lot of media scaremongering to spiral out of control. Especially when it comes to things like human interaction with the virus, etc. So yeah, what was the media coverage like?
So I think when bird flu started, when we knew how widespread it was going to be, a big concern of ours was that there would be a call for culls of wild birds. So either from the poultry sector or from, as you say, people really concerned that they're going into a park and they're seeing loads of dead swans and they're worried about their kids and that kind of stuff. And so what I was really pleasantly surprised with from the media is that I don't think we ever got a question about that, and we didn't get it from the UK poultry industry either, which is amazing. The thing I was a bit sad about, and I think you'll understand this, Jack, in the area that you cover, is, I mean, the media do not like gulls, and they didn't really turn against gulls with bird flu, but when all the black-headed gulls were dying all across England and Wales, the media were not interested, and that made me really sad because then, and people, you did get into that narrative of, oh, the gulls have brought it over, but I think generally I was pleasantly surprised that the media didn't turn on birds, and also the media have been interested year round in bird flu, so they have definitely, they have definitely been proactively reaching out to us for media coverage. We've not had to do a lot to get it in the media. It has been in the media, and I think that's just because it's been so widespread. So.
Yeah, and yeah, I know what you mean. It's unfortunately gulls always get the bad press, don't they? Or no press at all in this case. So we've got I'm mindful of time. We've got a few questions coming through. Would we be able to perhaps like kind of answer any of these questions following up or anything like that if we were to sort of compile them together? I'll just what I'll do is I'll just notice two questions that are fairly similarly related, so I'll just sort of combine them together from both Robert and Amy, which is Robert asks, can you say something about the human death recently in Texas from infection from a cow? How common is human effects of this disease? And then just following that up with Amy is, thank you for the interesting talk. What are the risks thought to be to visitors where bird flu is spreading on reserves? Incidentally noticed in the past week that it's been confirmed in cows in America.
Yes, I don't know anything about the cows more than that line. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't know more about that. So there have always bird flu deaths around the world are, so yeah, bird flu is not well suited to mammals, it's not well suited to humans, but the mortality rate is quite high. So the UK government does do sort of standard monitoring of people working with poultry, and there have been cases and been in the media of people who've had bird flu, been exposed to bird flu but recovered. So I mean the deaths worldwide are kind of in the hundreds, and that's over decades of bird flu, so it's pretty low level, and all of the deaths have been people who've worked in the poultry industry. So there's no known deaths of people who've been working with wild birds or ringers or people handling wild birds. But we did, I was saying before we logged on to do the proper web, in terms of visitors, we have tried to be sort of careful and pragmatic. So we put a lot of measures in last year where we stopped pond dipping on a lot of our reserves. So when we were having a lot of black-headed gull deaths, and they might have been in a larger pool or lake, but hydrologically that was maybe connected to the pond where we were doing pond dipping on reserves. So as a precaution, we stopped pond dipping. We've also done things, we are generally advising people not to feed ducks and geese, and just not to to bring birds into those concentrations and near people. So it is a pretty low risk, and as long don't handle any dead birds, keep your dog on a short lead, don't let your dogs near it. So it's a pretty low risk, but there's just a lot of unknowns. Going back to those slides where I was showing how the diversity of the viruses is kind of evolving all the time. And that's what all of the kind of mammal monitoring and everything is about, is people are worried about that mutation. But at the moment, we will have signs up on reserves. We sometimes have closed, if there are dead birds kind of on a path or a car park, we've closed off certain areas. But as long as you're not touching and handling things, you're okay. And the other thing I should say is that, for cooked meat and things like that, there's no risk and stuff as well. So be careful, but don't be overly scared, I'd say.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that, Claire. So yeah, just that brings us to the end of the webinar. Apologies there, we overran slightly, but there was just lots of questions coming through, and still yet some more. So thank you so much for joining us, Claire. It's been really interesting to hear all about the work that's going into monitoring avian influenza and what's being done across the UK. And I hope everyone else has learned a fair bit and feel up to speed with the situation. I just want to very quickly, plug a couple of things that are upcoming before we leave. So firstly, I believe there will be another webinar around the Ouse Valley project with Sussex Wildlife Trust. Details for that are yet to be confirmed, but please do just keep an eye out on the Sussex Ornithological Society website and social media channels for updates. Secondly, there is the 2024 Corn Bunting Survey this year. There are a number of squares yet to be filled, so please do just take a look at it if you haven't already and get signed up. I went for a casual walk with my partner around my now confirmed square just outside of Brighton a few weeks ago and was blessed with the sound of a number of wintering corn buntings singing. So cross my fingers that it will be a good show for the breeding season. There's a map of all the remaining squares where you can really, you can easily request a square, and so please do just take a look at that. And yeah, that brings us to the end of the webinar. So I hope you all have a great rest of your evening and have learned as much as I have from this evening's talk. So thanks very much again, Claire, and take care, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye.